Okay, so I think we're live. Hello, and welcome to the latest edition of our GMP on-air live stream series. Today we're going to cover SA360 data-driven attribution. My name is James, and I'm joined by my colleague Constantin.
Hi, everyone.
We're both GMP tech managers focusing on Search Ads 360. Before we kick off, I wanted to quickly call out that we've recently started an initiative where we're sending a bi-weekly GMP newsletter. So if you want to be kept up to date with all of the latest happenings as it pertains to Google Marketing Platform, I would suggest that you sign up following the instructions on the screen. I believe the link is also in the description box. So before we properly get started, I want to run through the agenda. As you can see, it's pretty jam-packed. We're going to start off with a brief recap of what attribution is and why it's important before moving on to implementation. So how you might set up a DDA model, subsequently a report to said model, and then a bid to the model in the end. We will then touch on some of the more common customer concerns around DDA. We'll briefly discuss some of the more recent product updates and how they relate to DDA before rounding things off with some discussion on testing DDA. We will have time for Q&A at the end, so if you do have questions, please submit them as we progress through the deck. So I'm just going to pass you over to Constantin now, who's going to give a brief run through on attribution and why it's important.
Thanks, James. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly talk to you about the concept of attribution, why it's important to create these models, have them in the interface, then that you can report on them and ultimately bid on them, which we'll cover a little bit later in the section. But first of all, setting the scene a little bit. As you know, in the last couple of years, digital marketing has become increasingly fragmented and complex. There's a lot of different customer journeys that involve way more than one interaction. As you can see on the screen, it's approximately 40%. And 90% of the people switch between different screens when completing tasks. That makes the user journey quite complex. So for example, if we make a little bit example, for example, James, you might be looking at buying a new racing bike. So you might be looking on his iPad, for example, at different models to buy. You might then look at his phone, look at different brands that he might be interested in before ultimately completing a purchase on the laptop. With the last click logic, you would only really value the last click of the laptop. But as you can see, the generic clicks that happen on the iPad and on the phone do have quite a lot of value. And with the data-driven attribution, or with attribution in general, you would attribute to these clicks. Putting it a little bit here into an example, this is a screenshot from Google Ads with the path to conversion. As you can see, roughly 70% of the conversions in this screenshot only have one click. That means up to 30% and over do have more than one click until an actual transaction happens, or an action that you would want this user to take on your website, right? So this obviously varies from vertical to vertical. So you might find that in the finance industry, you will have way more clicks in the path to conversion than, for example, in retail. So you would have to take a look for your own business. But taking out a last click approach, you would ignore all the subsequent clicks that happen after the ones before the final transaction. Having briefly touched upon the concept of attribution and the challenge of attribution, we have a couple of different solutions that are available, ready to use for you within the Google Suite. If we look at, for example, Google Ads, they have a capability of creating pretty quick and easy DDA models, and they're also actionable. Downside here is that it's only within one single channel, so it would only look at the clicks that happen within one engine. Google Analytics, for example, on the other hand, you would have different engines that you can include, different channels. You can create a DD model pretty simply. However, this one is not actionable at the end, so you can't really bid on it, which would be the downside here. Search Ads 360, on the other hand, does have cross channels, so you can include different engines, also different media engines such as Bing. You can have the cross device capability. The creation of the DDA model is pretty simple, and it's actionable at the end. So you can actually take it into the bidding strategies and bid on it effectively.
So in summary there, Constantin, we would say that Search Ads 360 is probably the best option if you want to bid to DDA, just given the fact that you have wider scope versus Google Ads.
Exactly.
And then subsequently you can obviously action DDA at the end.
Exactly. So if we look at Search Ad 360 a little bit more in detail, you have different models that are available for you ready to use. So if we take maybe a look at the last row first, you see that you have the first one on the top left, for example, is the last click. That's the model we all know. That's the one that's in there by default, which would attribute all the transaction value to the last click in the click path. You have also the first click, which would attribute all the value of the transaction back to the first click of the transaction path. You have linear that would divide the whole value of the transaction on all the touch points equally within the click path. You have the position base as well, which would distribute 40% of the transaction on the first and on the last click, and the remaining value on the path in between. And you have the time decay that would also provide the most value of the transaction to the last click, and then gradually move downwards. One thing to say about these models that you see in the bottom row, they're fixed and static, so they're based on rules, right? So they assign the credit based on rules. So they only take also into account the converting path, and they must be manually revisited once in a while. On the other hand, data-driven model actually is a dynamic algorithm that assigns credit based on the click where the conversion is due. It takes in the converting path and the non-converting path, and it always updated as it learns. So it's constantly learning.
And just a quick question. Obviously, we would recommend that you would go with the data-driven option. That's the best option. If, for instance, an advertiser couldn't go with that option or didn't want it for some reason, would you have any recommendation around what rules-based model they might use?
That's actually a really good question. So we appreciate that for some DDA models, for DDA models, you need a certain volume, and maybe you don't have that volume to create it. It really depends a little bit on your business needs. So for example, as a retailer, you might want to weigh the last click a little bit heavier than the other ones. So time decay might make sense. If you want to go into the attribution subject a little bit more, you can also try a linear model a little bit. Also important to say is that you don't have only limit to one attribution model within Search Ad 360. So you could create different models. You could create a time decay model. You could create a linear, and you would also have maybe the last click. You can add columns for these and compare the metrics as you go along, and then see which one reflects the best in terms of your business needs. Right. So having touched upon what attribution is, what models we have, I just want to point out quickly why is it actually important. So there are three main important points to cover. One is that the reporting will be more accurate, right? So you would, as we mentioned, you would transport some of the value of the floodlight back to the earlier paths. So you would have better reporting in that sense. And at the same time, with that better reporting, you might find that you have better resources to make efficient budget allocations. So you might find that some generic campaigns that you might have undervalued do have quite a lot of upper funnel activity and they're capped by budget. So you might want to transition some of the budget to these generic campaigns. At the same time, if you include these DDA models into your bidding, you might find that the bidding is actually more effective as all of the click points, all of the click paths get the right conversion value. So having covered the concept of attribution, why it's important, James, do you want to walk through the implementation of these DDA models?
Yeah, great. So as you begin your journey with DDA in Search Ads 360, the first step will be to create a DDA model. Just before starting off, it's important to note that there are some requirements volume-wise. The activity that you wish to include in the DDA model will need to have generated 15,000 clicks at a minimum and 600 conversions over the last 30 days. You're also going to need to have 90 days worth of floodlight data in the system. This is how far back the DDA model will look when it's learning. In terms of actually setting up a DDA model in Search Ads 360, these models are channel grouping based. So channel grouping is essentially a method of bucketing your keywords according to their position in the funnel. So these channel groupings essentially act as nodes. They feed information into the system, which combined with our algorithm enables optimal attribution capability. There's two options if you want to set up a DDA model in Search Ads 360, and these are differentiated by the method of channel grouping. So you have the custom channel grouping option and the automated channel grouping option. So I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of those options. The first is the custom DDA model. So this requires a little bit more manual labor. You'll need to actually create the channel groupings yourself. You create these channel groupings via labeling. So you label up your activity essentially, and those labels are then incorporated into a DDA model and become channel groupings. So if we take a quick example, you might basically label up your activity by brand and generic very basically, and subsequently those brand and generic labels will become the channel groupings in your DDA model. Few points to note. It's important to label up 100% of your activity. You also want to aim for around 2 to 5, like between 2 to 5 channel groupings. You have the option of creating 15 altogether. However, that's not recommended. We want to make sure the channel groupings are significant and not too granular. And thus, yeah, we aim for the range of 2 to 5. So once you actually have set up your channel groupings or your labels, you then go into the attribution tab, go through the process. You'll select new data-driven attribution. You'll name your model. Then you'll select the relevant floodlight tag or tags. And once you've done that, you'll be given the option to select the labels, or which then become the channel grouping. So you'll select brand and generic, and you'll then go and click save.
And quick question here, James. Once you click save, will this DDA model be already ready to use for reporting and ultimately bidding as well?
So that's a good question. The DDA model won't be ready for, it won't be reported upon, nor will it be bid upon automatically. You will actually have to take some steps in order to actually enable that. And the model will take 24 hours to learn. So, okay, it's not going to be automatically ready. I will go into the steps required to actually enable reporting and bidding in a few slides' time. But yeah, so this kind of rounds off the custom DDA model option. The second option that you would have is the automated channel grouping option. So with this option, essentially the difference is that the system will create the channel groupings for you. So very basically, the system will divide your activity between upper and lower funnel. This is like quite a simple way to create a DDA model. If you are new to DDA, I would suggest that you go with this option. The only potential downside is that you can't actually visualize the channel groupings in the UI. This is a minor concern from my perspective. I wouldn't let it discourage you from actually going with this option. So you essentially go through the steps that I went through in the previous slide, except for when you come to the channel grouping option, you select automatically create channel groupings, as you can see on screen there, and it will auto create the channel groupings for you.
Quick question on this point. So advertisers often create new campaigns, right? New biddable items that they add to the advertiser. If you create this, would they be automatically included into the DDA?
Okay, so that's a good question. It differs for each of the options. So for the custom option, you would actually need to probably set up an automated rule, which would add new activity into the channel groupings as you go along. It would add the activity in based on a number of different criteria that you would set yourself. Okay. With the automated channel grouping option, any new activity would automatically be added into the channel groupings.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and important to note as well that obviously there is that 24-hour learning period at the beginning, as I mentioned. However, the model will continue to learn and update every week. So when you do add new activity via rules or automatically via automated channel groupings, the model will update to reflect this new activity as well.
All right.
Okay. And also just one other point to note, when you set up a model, obviously the model will learn by looking back at historical data, but it will then actually, once it has learned, it will apply retroactively to the last 60 days of data. So it's not going to be just applied moving forward. It will be applied retroactively as well.
Cool.
So yeah, so you kind of actually touched on this with your question, Consti. In order to report on this data or to visualize the DDA data, you actually need to take some action. You need to set up some reporting columns. So I imagine that you would have last click columns set up which reflect the floodlight or floodlights that you've included in your DDA model. Simply, like all you need to do is go in and copy for instance, this last click column, and you would, in this example, for instance, the column is named GTM transactions. We add the DDA label, so we say GTM transactions DDA. We go down to the attribution model drop-down menu and deselect last click, select DDA. Ensure cross environment conversions are also selected, and save. So now we've basically set up a relevant DDA column which reflects the model that we have already created. So you have that column in the interface. Now you want to go and you want to be able to compare the DDA column with the last click column. So you will set up a formula column which essentially churns out a percentage difference between last click and DDA. So you should be able to visualize that, like what the result of said column in this screenshot. So you can see that there's a drop of 2.01%. For the portion of activity that is selected in this screenshot.
I have a quick question here. In this screenshot, you can only see that the actual transactions, we take the transaction as last click and then create the column with the transactions reporting on DDA and the difference. But obviously, for example, CPA or ROAS targets are also super important. Could you do the same process with the CPA column?
Yeah, you could do the exact same process. So you would take your last click CPA column for argument's sake, and then create an identical DDA version of that column, obviously changing last click to DDA, and then create your percentage difference column to find out how the CPA stack up against each other.
Might be an interesting addition since you're adding quite a few columns here. If you want to have a quick view on just always looking at these metrics, it might make sense to pull these columns in and then save a view, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So then if you want to look at the DDA perspective, you can always just select the DDA view that you might have selected with the respective columns. You don't need to pull them in every time.
That's a good point. So you could set up a new DDA view, saves time, or indeed you could add the new DDA columns into the views that you use on a day-to-day basis currently. Right.
So we've covered a lot here with the DDA creation. We've created this little checklist here for you that you can go through and just basically tick it off to make sure that you've set it up correctly and that you're confident using it also in the bidding. So maybe just to run through it really briefly, make sure when you set up the DDA model that you have 15,000 clicks or roughly 600 conversions in the last 30 days. If you do not have that amount, it might lead to errors when you create the DDA model. Once you create it at the beginning, make sure that you already have 3 months of floodlight data in the account. This is important because we look at the last 90 days initially when we create the model. So that make sure that you have that already in the interface. When using the manual channel groupings, as James mentioned, we recommend to use 2 to 5 labels in total, not more, because you would make it too granular. We want to make it that every label has quite a significant amount of volume. Subsequently, when assigning the manual labels, it's super important that you really try and cover 100% of the account, not just partially of the account, simply because the click path, you want to include really every single keyword that might have a click, right? Or that might trigger an ad that subsequently triggers a click. So you want to really have the whole customer journey, not any gaps. Once you have all these points ticked off, then you would go about creating your DDA model. When you create it, really ensure that you select the right floodlight activity that you want to use to attribute the activity back, and also the right labels, because you might have quite a few labels in your account. Really make sure that you select the ones that you really created for these channel groupings. When you create a new model, make sure that you create the respective columns, as James mentioned, so you really reflect the floodlight data, the transactions, and the CPA within the floodlight column using the attribution model. And then you can create that final column. It's a nice add-on, I think, where you can create the last click and the DDA model in the formula column, where you take the difference, so you always have the percentage uplift or downlift for the respective campaigns. Cool. So now that we talked about the DDA creation, let's quickly go into how to actually make this data actionable through bidding. There's a couple of tips that we recommend when you use DDA models in the bidding. One is, don't simply create the model, wait 24 hours after it's ready to use, and then put it straight away into a bidding strategy. We would recommend really to have a column, report on it for 2 weeks, just to make sure that the data that is coming in is actually consistent and is accurate and reflects the data that you would expect, right? So just to make sure that the data is coming in correctly. Then we have tip 2 and 3, which kind of go hand in hand. It's either if you have a bidding strategy and an existing bidding strategy, if you switch it to DDA, or creating a new bidding strategy for the DDA, right? It's really a little bit up to your own personal preference, whatever works, whatever you feel more comfortable with. But our algorithm in the bidding strategies is robust enough to just go into the attribution, changing the attribution model and bidding on it. You might trigger a little bit of a calibration phase, so don't be worried when you see in the overview tab that there's going to be that wheel that shows that it's training. The floodlight data is there and should be quite a smooth transition to DDA models. Jumping to tip number 4, when you add the campaigns, or make sure that you add the campaigns or ad group levels, not keywords, to the bidding strategy, to make sure that all the bid modifiers are being taken into consideration, and also the cross environment implies.
So I guess there will be ad group or higher, right?
Yes.
So like you could do campaign either. Yeah. I generally would recommend customers, if possible, to apply the campaign level. It minimizes work and make sure everything is functional.
Absolutely. And also tip 5 is, since you're going to use the attribution model for the bidding, that means that all the different click points will get the conversion value due. You might find that the overall conversion volume will increase as the bidding is more effective, as you're not just bidding to the last click, you're really taking the whole conversion funnel into account. And
on that, Consti, obviously volumes could change. Do we generally see much of a difference between the CPAs that come through for last week DDA? Like, how should I set my target?
That is actually a really, really good point. When you add the DDA model into the bidding strategy, make sure you look at the DDA column that James showed how to create it before, because you might find that the CPA target, or the CPA that is reflected in the column, might be a little bit different. Since, especially, for example, strategies that target more upper funnel activity or generic keywords, you might find that with the DDA, you're pushing a little bit of the floodlight value upwards, right, to the upper funnel. So the DDA CPA might be a bit lower, right? So when you create the columns, take a look how the CPAs are changing with last click, because you might find when adding the attribution model, you might need to adjust it downwards or upwards to reflect the new attribution model.
Makes sense.
Now that we've covered the bidding as well, there are a couple of common concerns that advertisers often come across when switching DDA models, or with the whole DDA process. We've listed a couple here. First one being, for example, I'm uncomfortable with the creation of channel groupings which reflect my path to conversion. James, with this question, do you have any advice here on this one?
Yeah, so with this one, you could take the automated channel grouping approach, as I ran through previously. It avoids you having to actually, channel group your activity and decide how your activity is positioned in your funnel. You could take a simple manual approach, so you could apply labels like brand and generic and then incorporate them into a bid strategy, or you could maybe divide your activity by upper, middle and lower funnel. Another option might be to look into Campaign Manager if you have access, to examine some of the reports in there, figure out what keywords are assisting, what keywords are converting more so, and then that might enable you to channel group your activity more appropriately. It's kind of up to you, but there are a number of options, and important to be aware that you cannot create up to 5 DDA models by default in the interface. So, setting up an initial model that is maybe a little bit more basic is not really going to be problematic. You can report on that model and subsequently bid on it if you wish, or just report on it and then subsequently create a better model in the future and then bid to that model. So, it's not it's not black and white. You have options. Cool. So, now that we've addressed that issue, the conversion that I care about isn't actually generating enough volume to support a DDA model. What might you suggest around that, Constantin?
That's a good question, and we appreciate that the volume that you need to create an efficient DDA model might be somewhat high for certain verticals, since you need roughly 600 in the last 30 days. So what we recommend here is that maybe you could also add a floodlight pixel 1 or 2 stages before, right? So for example, not just measuring the transaction page, maybe also the shopping cart if it would be a retailer or a product page. So you would also include these floodlights. You can then also weigh them, right? So you could say that your final transaction, you want to value it with 100%, and maybe one step as a final step before, which would be maybe the checkout page, you would want to value it with, for example, 70 or 80%, right? Combined, these might already give you the number that you are looking for when creating a DDA model. Alternatively, if you really can't reach this, there's also a possibility to go onto one of the rule-based models that we've seen before. For example, a time decay model or a linear model. This is just, as you mentioned, you don't really have just one capability of creating just one model. You create several and see which one fits the best for you.
Makes sense. But I guess if you did want to stick with DDA and you didn't want to go into set up a formula column with weightings, etc., you could, if the volume allowed, you could just target the one step above in the funnel.
Exactly.
So, for instance, if your quote to sale ratio was reasonably consistent, you could make assumptions around how many sales will be generated by a quote and just go after quotes in your bid strategy. In your DDA model, and hence your bid strategy. But yeah.
Cool. But now that we've figured out this one, a question that often comes up is, does not having yesterday and today's data limit the bid op effectiveness when adding it into a bidding strategy? So
this is a slight limitation. However, our system is constantly updating, refreshing, and predicting for unarrived conversions. So this still allows us to update bids multiple times per day under the legacy SH60 bidding system. So it would have been 4x times per day. But now in this new auction time world, we're still bidding in real time. So this isn't a hindrance. DDA is fully compatible and is good to go. So that's not really an issue. However, a lot of businesses do report on a last click basis. Do you think moving to DDA would be problematic for those businesses?
Short answer is no, it's not, because the column of the last click will not vanish, right? You will always have the last click column ready for you to report on everything, right? So even if you would duplicate the last click column, take the same floodlight activity and change the attribution model to a DDA attribution model, you would have the two columns in parallel. You could use the DDA column also to bid on it, while still using the last click model for reporting. So that's absolutely no problem.
That makes sense.
Why do the DDA conversions sometimes differ when you compare them from last click?
Okay, so there's a few reasons for this. One of them I've kind of mentioned already, reporting. Important to exclude yesterday and today's data when comparing to last click, because that's always going to create differences. Second to that, if you have, for instance, display activity under the same floodlight configuration in Campaign Manager, that may draw credit away from search and cause you to see differences between DDA and last click. If you have multiple advertisers in your Search Ads 360 agency, credit could be reattributed between these advertisers. So if you're looking at an advertiser view, you're going to maybe see a difference between last click and DDA as a result. And then lastly, rounding occurs with regard to DDA, not the case with last click, and this can cause a differential. Also, like if you integrate social, for instance, so you've integrated Facebook, credit can be reattributed between search and Facebook, not the case for last click necessarily. So that will cause potential differences as well. So all of these things are important to be aware of and can cause conversions to be different between DDA and last click.
Okay, cool.
Okay, great. So now that we've addressed some of the more common concerns, I want to quickly run through some recent product updates and just highlight how the DDA might interact with these product updates. So one of the bigger ones is auction time bidding. You might be aware of this. Essentially, with auction time bidding, we are marrying the enterprise capability of floodlight data with the query level auction time bidding, so real time bidding capability of the Google Ads algorithm. So we essentially are pushing floodlight data into Google Ads, combining that with the Google Ads algorithm to achieve an optimal bidding result. So with this, like DDA is fully compatible. It won't be the DDA model that you've set up in Google Ads, which is significant. It will be the DDA model that's in Search Ads 360, which matters. So you'll go through the standard process of setting up a bid strategy. The only difference is you will select the auction time bidding tick box, and you'll then select your Search Ads 360 DDA model, as you would have done with legacy bidding in the past. And then it will take effect. So just to point out that DDA and other attribution models are non-last click attribution models are fully compatible with auction time bidding.
Cool.
So next up is Google Ads conversions in Search Ads 360 bid strategies. So obviously, we now have the ability to bid to Google Ads conversions. They're pulled in from Google Ads in the form of Google Ads conversion trackers. This is important for a lot of advertisers that want to bid to things like store visits or phone calls, for instance, and mightn't have been able to do that previously with Search Ads 360. So if we take the example of an automotive manufacturer, they might have a floodlight set up for test drives, but they also want to bid to store visits. So they would pull in a Google Ads conversion tracker, which reflects store visits, and maybe combine that Google Ads conversion tracker with a floodlight in a bid strategy. How would this interact with DDA, though, you might ask? The DDA model in Search Ads 360, if you were to incorporate it into the bid strategy as well, would only apply to the floodlight. So it would only apply to the test drive floodlights. It wouldn't actually apply to the Google Ads conversion tracker, store visits in this instance. Store visits would be impacted by your setup in Google Ads. So if you have DDA set up in Google Ads, this DDA model would be applied to your store visits conversion tracker. So that's just something to be aware of when you're setting up your bid strategy in Search Ads 360. The DDA model will only apply to the floodlight that you've included, won't apply to the Google Ads conversion tracker that you've included. Okay. And then lastly, just a very brief update. Obviously, Search Ads 360 budget bid strategies have been around for a while now. Just to point out that they are fully compatible with DDA, so you can select to bid to DDA as well when setting up a budget bid strategy which works to conversions. Great. So just now that we've covered the more recent updates, I wanted to touch upon how we might test DDA. Just to point out, testing DDA isn't straightforward. It's not necessarily something we would recommend. There are a number of reasons for this. You can't do standard A/B testing with DDA. So things like Google Ads, drafts and experiments won't necessarily work with DDA because we can't guarantee that a user is going to stay on one side of the experiment. They might shift between the control and experiment. This is problematic, spoils results. Another thing is timelines. So the results or like the benefits of DDA don't become visible immediately or in a short space of time. They will compound over a longer period of time. And naturally with testing, we do have a limit in terms of how much time we can wait to see results. So that's just important to be aware of. We do have a couple of options though. They are imperfect, but I'll allow Constantin to maybe go through them now.
Cool. Thank you, James. So as James pointed out, testing is a little bit tricky, but there are two options that you can consider if you really need to prove the incrementality of DDA. So one is just a pre and post test. So what you would do is you would have, for example, a bidding strategy, just bidding towards last click for a time frame, roughly 6 weeks, for example, would be advisable. Shorter might be a little bit more problematic. You would take these 6 weeks and then you could change within the bidding strategy your attribution model to the DDA attribution model. As mentioned, you might trigger a little bit of a calibration period. So make sure when you're comparing the data to take these calibration periods out, and then you would run it for the same time frame as you would have with the last click on the DDA. After that time frame is complete, you can compare the results that happen, that the transactions and CPA or the metrics that you really care about as a business, and then compare them from the DDA perspective to the last click perspective. And then you can make a rough analysis. Already here you can see that seasonality might play a role. So it would be recommended to take it into do the testing when the seasonality is relatively stable.
Yeah.
Another option that you might consider is a little bit more comprehensive. It's the Jira experiment. Here you would roughly divide up the test location into two parts, and one you would have bidding on last click, while the other one you would have bidding on DDA, right? After that, you could have the analysis ready and then compare how the data would manifest.
And obviously this a geo experiment is quite a big undertaking. So if possible, I would recommend maybe sticking to the pre-post test if, you know, as Constantin mentioned, your activity is reasonably consistent. There aren't any major volume spikes or there isn't too much seasonality. Option one would probably be preferred.
Cool. So now we've run through all the material that we have. There was a question, Dory, in the link. Should we just check out if there's any Q&As?
Look very quickly.
Cool.
Okay, let's see if there's any questions.
Wait. Think.
So after how long can you report on this? 3 months, a month? So you can report on DDA pretty much straight away once the model is actually trained. So you'll need to wait around 24 hours for the model to train. So, and once it has, you'll be able to report. So you'll set up the columns as I described, and you should see data flow through. Obviously, there is that delay of yesterday and today's data, but yeah, you should be good to go after 24 hours.
Exactly. Maybe when you're setting up the DDA model, make sure you have already 90 days of flatlet interaction. And then we're looking at these 90 days and apply the model for the last 60 days, and then it will continue running. So you can report on it going forward. If we use an external tool for DDA, what would be the best way to migrate to GMP? So we do appreciate that there's quite a lot of external attribution models out there, for example, ExactTag, a lot of different ones. You can integrate them. You would have to integrate them through the campaign manager, and then these would be pushed directly into Search Ad 360, and then they're actionable, right? So the data that is pushed from the external attribution model, we basically take it as it is, including the conversion delay and everything that is pushed into it. We would then have the external attribution model ready to use. You would even see in the Search Ad 360 interface that it says external attribution model, and then you could just add it into the bidding, right? Yeah. Maybe the best way is to talk to your account managers when it comes to implementing this if you need any technical help.
Okay. Does the SA360 DDA model take into account other channels that are tagged in CM? Yes, it does. So if you have tagged channels like display in Campaign Manager, these channels will be taken into account. As I mentioned, credit might be redistributed from search to display or from display to search. Similarly, with things like social, credit can be reattributed between search and social. So to answer that question, it's a yes.
Mm-hmm. I see another question here. If we select several floodlights between the middle funnel and the lower funnel, the system can understand which of these objectives is more important to the business. How can we specify? So what you can do is you can actually create weighting for these, right? So you could say that the final stage would be the most important for you, and then start weighting this down. And that's a way to give the model the importance of how when creating.
And this is most important when it comes to the bidding stage. So the model might be smart enough to learn itself, but when you come to bidding, it's important to weight appropriately in a formula column and then incorporate it into your bid strategy. So yeah, basically, if you have quotes and sales, it's a simple example, you might weight sales more heavily, maybe 2 to 1, to reflect the relative importance. So we have a few more questions then.
Yes. See. Pull this down.
Yeah. Can DDA work with offline conversions? Yes, DDA can work with offline conversions. You can pull your offline conversions in. The only limitation is that they would need to be they would need to have a 24-hour timestamp. So the click would need to have occurred within 24 hours in order for you to actually incorporate it into a DDA model.
And as it drains consistently, it's also really important that you make sure that you upload these floodlight conversions, even if they haven't happened just yet, with the timestamp, that you upload them regularly on a regular basis. So every 24 hours would be great.
Okay. I think that's pretty much it.
Pretty much it.
Cool. Well, that's it, guys. Thanks very much for your time. I hope it was useful. And see you next time.
Right. Bye, guys.
Bye.